Thank you, everyone, and welcome to the Warburg events system, so to speak, online. This is the third session of Renaissance Life. Today, we're going to talk about Botticelli, who was an almost exact contemporary of Bosch. They are only 5 years apart. We were looking at Bosch at the last session. And although they are only 5 years apart, they couldn't be more different artists. And although we know quite a bit about Bosch, we know now far more about Botticelli because Botticelli was working at the time in what was perhaps the artistic and intellectual center of Europe. And because much research has been done both on his work, but also on the workshop system within which he functioned, so that we can understand his work not only as the authorship of one individual, but as a work of collaboration that goes to the hierarchy of the workshop, but that also extends to a very complex networks of connections between different workshops in Florence. Now, to discuss this, we are indeed very privileged to have two scholars who have indeed very much contributed to the knowledge and understanding of Botticelli and his work. And so we are going to discuss with Anna Debenedetti, who was a curator at the Victoria and Albert Museum and a director at Culturespaces. She's the author of the book Botticelli, Artist and Designer, as well as the curator of the exhibition, which has the same title, which is currently in Paris at the Musée Jacques Marandré. And joining me to discuss Botticelli with Anna is Michel O'Malley, who is Professor Emeritus at the Warburg Institute and who has also written extensively on Botticelli and on the culture of workshop. So, Michel, I let you begin the conversation.
Thank you, François. I want to start by congratulating Anna on her exhibition in Paris. It is a fantastic show. And some of what I learned there last week will come into the discussion. I'm sure Anna has plenty to say from working on the exhibition and seeing those pictures so closely and for so long. But I wanted to start by asking you, Anna, why Botticelli? What prompted your interest? What research questions instigated your writing? What got this all off the ground?
Well, thank you, Michel. Hello, everyone. I think it's a long run, really, because already when I was doing my doctoral thesis, my PhD on Marsilio Ficino and the relations with the beginning of the history of art, of theory of art, I was looking at Botticelli from a very specific angle, especially the Taslimanic images. It was a very Warburgian theme in a way. And I think when I was entrusted with the exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum in 2016, titled Botticelli Reimagined, we looked at Botticelli from modern day, from the present, and we looked back at what it was and how his art is still so vivid today and has provided most of the composition, even without really noticing it. So the idea was really to try and understand why Botticelli was so modern, why Botticelli could be called a designer, in the real sense of the term. So I think from there, I really started to investigate what will be the specificity of Botticelli's workshop that will make him such an adaptable figures, how his design or his composition will still speak to our modern days, will still speak to our media, because you can find Botticelli's work everywhere now, even on a mouse pad or anywhere, or even, altered, and you still recognize him. So I think these questions were very interesting and prompted me to look at Botticelli through a slightly different angle, from the angle of making and devising, rather than perhaps the commissions and what history of art would usually look first to recontextualize an artist within his own time.
Do you think he can be considered a designer more than other painters can?
I don't think well, not in his days, but for sure, his very distinctive style has made him a polymath, someone that was easily inspirable and adaptable to different media. And I think that this very peculiar linearity of his style, especially in the drawing, makes him a very inspirable figure. But at the time, if you look back at the time, many artists were providing designs for all kind of arts. So it's a very interesting and strange situation. And I think here there is something that really escape our understanding. It's why are we touched by one design rather than another? Why do we recognize something immediately rather than something else? And for me, this is the Botticelli touch. It is something that you can't understand, but you can recognize and you can cherish in a way.
Let's turn to the drawings now. You made a significant finding about Botticelli's possible training that relates to Botticelli's possible training as a goldsmith. And I wonder if, with these two drawings in front of us, you can talk us through the path of your research and the point you want to make about his training in particular.
Well, it was always been a big debate. Who was this Botticelli master that Vasari mentioned in the life of Botticelli? Botticelli was actually his elder brother Giovanni, from whom he took this nickname. And this goldsmith, which is probably true, because when you look at his drawings, it's so linear, so close to this very refined technique developed by goldsmiths at the time, because when you incise the metal, then it is done. You can't really change or alter anything. So I was looking into drawings and to this way of drawing, really, and I was always fascinated by this similarity with Maso Finiguera. But how do you explain, how do you find a way to think that Maso could have been this master? And it was, therefore, what is the link? What is the missing link? And by looking into the history of Maso connections, family connections, and the localization of his workshop in Florence, it emerges that actually the Filippepi, Botticelli's family, and the Finiguera were not only neighbors, but they were also connected to each other by marriage, because Botticelli's brother was actually married Nera, who was a Finiguera. So all these links, and the fact that another brother would supply Finiguera with gold because he was a batiloro, and there was some notes, credit notes lying around, so to speak, make this absolutely plausible. And to me, the most plausible was actually the drawing style, which was so close. And when you look at these two drawings, of course, years apart, because Maso died in 64, and the Dante's cycle starts within the 80s. Where exactly we don't know, when exactly we don't know, but you can really feel this kind of filiation between the two. And not only this peculiar linearity that is so specific to them, but also the way they distribute the figures on this rectangular format, on this landscape format, the way they really inhabits all the space, the way they give life to these figures, and the use of some perspective, and the not use of perspective as well, which they play very in a very interesting way. I think this is a really compelling argument. But of course, this is of course subjective, because we all see with our own eyes, of course.
It is a compelling argument. It would put Botticelli with him when Botticelli, was quite young.
Yes, and you could actually, well, there is two readings of what Vasari of one, no, not Vasari, sorry, but one early account when actually the father of Botticelli says, my son is not very well, and sta a legare, which you could read two different ways in Italian. One way is to say is learning to read, and the other is learning to fuse the metal. And I think it's philologically, it's closer to actually the metal side of things rather than reading, because of the age of Botticelli at the time when this declaration was made. He was about 13, which makes exactly the age that he would spend in a shop, in whatever shop, and because of that. Actually, that makes sense. You wouldn't say a leggere because they would go to the Abacco, so the school of Abacco. So I presume he would have used a different term if he was to say he's learning to read. So that would also absolutely go in this direction.
Do we know anything about Masso's workshop?
Yeah, we know where it was. Not so far from actually the first house of the Filippi, because the Filippi moved. They were still in Onisanti quarter, but they moved in '64 when the father bought the house where Botticelli would a few years later actually set up his own workshop at the ground floor. So there was anyway, and it is what I'm trying to explain in the first chapter of the book, some kind of zoning, if you can use this really strange term, professions that would gather together in some part of the city, which was not such a big city, so you could actually walk across the city very easily. But you had this kind of gathering of profession. Botticelli actually was a bit off the path, and it was closer to actually the goldsmith's world than the painter's world. But it was, anyway, they were all close by.
Do we know anyone else who studied with Masso, or is that not?
No, it's not known, but we know he had a good, well, quite an important workshop. Had many dealing in trades with many different people. So you imagine there were some garzoni, some assistants coming and going. How many? It's impossible to say because we have no.
I know,
no
it's
count.
so hard to say for so many people. Given this look at Masso and Botticelli drawing together, I wanted to look briefly at the way Botticelli trained people in his own workshop. And you've reproduced the study of two nudes that has long been given to Botticelli. And I've asked François to put next to it this drawing by Filippino Lippi that's at the Christchurch Gallery here in the UK, dated 1475. This is dated when Filippino is in Botticelli's workshop. And it suggests, and this isn't my interpretation, it's Carmen Bambach and George Goldner, drawings from models. So these were not 4 or 3 people standing together, they were individual studies. And it looks like Botticelli was setting up this kind of thing. So his own training in drawing from Masso, or as you say, certainly a goldsmith, seems to have informed his own very strong interest in making sure his assistants were practicing drawing. And you can see just before you move that, François, if you can go down again, you can see that figure on our far right was posing, holding a pole to help him keep the pose. So we know that these were posed figures, but certainly your work makes it clear why this may have been so very, very important.
Yeah, and if you look at the many drawings left by Maso, actually there are many drawings left by Maso, yes. And you go to the Uffizi and you ask for the dedicated box, you will find endless Gazzoni posing for another in order to train.
That's right.
Especially there is one very touching where he's actually taking the pose and really not happy to do so and have a very grim face. So yeah, so this is basically the ad hoc training that you would gain in a workshop at the time before the academy set up a very systematic way of learning art, if you can learn art anyway.
Yeah.
If I can add just a little remark, the big ear, which is next to
Yes.
that figure, it's part of the idea of learning to do the parts of the body as part of learning to draw, isn't it?
Yeah, and you have ears, you have hands, which are the most
Yeah.
difficult things to do. The folding as well, and we know all these interesting studies about the folding, especially the Verrocchio folds. So yeah, every single part, and this is also part of I think this strategy of composition that Botticelli will build up, using these body parts in a way and being able to reassemble them, and then therefore recontextualize and renew his art each time from a pool, a stock of motif.
The next set of slides will take us back to Botticelli's own training and his very early career.
This one?
No, sorry, the one after that.
Well, that's an early one anyway.
These,
Okay.
where we can see Botticelli responding to his peers in a way, but painters who are much better established. You have shown these in the exhibition, Anna, and again, I wondered if you wanted to talk us through what you'd like to pull out of these comparisons.
Yeah, well, the exhibition is set up in a very didactical way, if I may say so, trying to really make the wider public understand the training and how you become an artist, how do you become a painter within this large workshop. And this beautiful Madonna and Child by Filippo Lippi, coming from the Alte Pinacoteca in Munich, is presented side by side with the version in the Louvre of Botticelli. And so copying was absolutely part of the training, because you would what was the most important thing was to actually imitate the master, so you can become the little hand, the delegation, the one that could actually finish one work initiated by the master, but with no differences in style. So copying was really a way to take this completely cancel your own personality and really fuse within the style of the master. But here it's very interesting, because even though Botticelli is actually looking at the model and really reproducing it, it introduces a lot of subtle differences. For one, you can see that the setting of the two figures are not the same. They are slightly more distant from the viewer. In Filippo, you have this really sweetness of the Madonna, which is slightly more absorbed into her child in Botticelli's version. And in Filippo Lippi, you have this kind of apparition of this holy couple in front of this beautiful landscape. Whereas in Botticelli, by introducing the parapet on the back, it immediately rearticulates the foreground and the background, and therefore you feel like you're in front of someone in a loggia, looking, on a landscape. So that, I think, are the subtle differences. And Botticelli is really looking at his master, capitalizing a lot on his master's art, because he will pay tribute throughout his career to the invention of his master. I think there's a real love for Filippo and for Filippo's art, but at the same time trying to introducing his own personality. And I think that is what is in nuce, in progress, in this very early work from the Louvre. And this is how you you build up. And also for me it was extremely interesting to present two copies which are not the same, because this is really something that will become the hallmark of Botticelli's workshop. When Botticelli does replicas, they're never exactly the same. There is always subtle differences, and therefore I would say there are more replicas than copies, because they're not identical at all. Because you don't need to. Everything was probably commissioned, at least the one we show in the exhibition. So there was the people would know what they would commission. There was no need that it would be exactly the same. And I think that is an extremely interesting, also as a commercial strategy, because you would be able to replicate, to do work that have a common matrix, but are slightly different anyways.
So do you think that Botticelli, that's the third picture along from what we're seeing on the screen, do you think that was done within Filippo's workshop, or do you think that was done a little later? In other words, did that go out the door as something that was bought from the Filippo shop?
That is difficult to say because we have no contract, no nothing.
No.
I think what is striking is the proportion of the two, which are very, very close when you see them side by side. Despite this different ratio within the picture plane, the two pictures are very much the same size and the same dimensions. So you would expect that it is either a commission or something that Botticelli will have. It's very difficult to say, and I think at some point you need to stop trying to do too many hypotheses. But yes, I would think it would have been within the shop of Filippo.
So a very early work. Yeah.
Very early work, yes.
And then the Verrocchio, the National Gallery Verrocchio on the far right, and another picture from the Louvre is very, very similar. I think you move I think these are dated a little bit later.
Yes, absolutely. And this is the progression within the first room. And of course, there is one big missing painting here, is the one from Capodimonte attributed to Botticelli, which is exactly very much closer to Verrocchio. Yeah. And Verrocchio attribution is a recent attribution anyway from the National Gallery team, especially Jean Delcaton and Lux Eisen, who published a few years ago a technical studies showing that this was very much Verrocchio. But here, what really struck me with, even though of course, the Capodimonte is closer to the Verrocchio, is this very peculiar hand that she is. If you look at the Madonna Campana, it seems that it is almost the same, exactly the same design that is reproduced in the Campana picture, which is the one on the left. And the motif of the Madonna Lactans that you will never find again in Botticelli's career, apart from the Palabardi and the derivation of the Palabardi. So that is absolutely, in my opinion, very interesting. We know Verrocchio's shop was not so far from Botticelli's own shop. I think it must have been when Botticelli has come back to Florence, when he set up his own workshop at his father's house between 67 and 69, 70. But by 70, thanks to Benedetto Dei, we know he was already a well-established artist with a big workshop. So imagine that between 77, when actually Filippo went to Spoleto and Benedetto Dei's writing, something has happened which make Botticelli on the fore of the artistic scene in Florence. And we need to remember that these shops were extremely open onto the street. There was a lot of exchanges, and it doesn't. And so any kind of paintings were able to be contemplated, explored, studied by others, without being inevitably a member of the workshop. And I think that is very important for the circulation of motif, because there have been, of course, some debate about Botticelli being a member of Verrocchio's workshop, but I don't think so. Especially as a chronology, it doesn't stand at all. But as someone who would go and see the old master, go and look at his work, trying to emulate, trying to see something different from what he saw from his master in Plato. It's perfectly fine for someone who was developing his own art.
And the Verrocchio, if indeed it is a Verrocchio, is another play on a composition invented by Filippo. Yes.
Yes.
And
so you
which
have this kind of
Botticelli, I mean, as you say, if we had the Capodimonte picture, we would, you would be able to show it in your first room. But that the angel that's very far in the back and is nearly hidden is really quite daring, much more daring in the Lippi than it is here or in any of the Botticelli kind of riffs on that idea, I think. But it's perfectly clear that artists were looking at that Lippi and thinking, oh, that's a good idea. I think I'll try something like it.
Well, yes, and also being, on this Lippi matrix, it makes it all the more desirable. What can I do as a painter from what I learned from my master, and what others do, and how can I, take some inspiration from that as well? I think Botticelli, as I studied him, is a very sensitive person, a great observer of whatever surrounding him, from the work of his peers to, in all media. I'm trying to show this in the book and also in exhibition, that even the medals are a source of inspiration for Botticelli. So every single small element is transformed, adapted, sublimated in a way in Botticelli's art.
You've made a very compelling argument for the way Botticelli, as his career gets going, begins to reuse particular models. And the book is well illustrated, but the book is small. And so I thought we could take this group of models that you propose in your first kind of group of comparisons, and that you might talk us through how you see his making work similar, but also making them different, but building them around the same model.
Yeah, and with this series, actually, it's very interesting because we can go even far back by looking at remembering Lippi's model, Capodimonte, and the fact that the Chigi Madonna that we see here on the top left is actually deriving from the Capodimonte. Mm-hmm. And she will give birth to this series, because if you look at the Madonna from in these 4 pictures, she's almost in the same position. It's just a play with the turn of the head, and the baby is slightly positioned in different ways, but it reproduces the hand, especially the hand in the Chigi, the Madonna del Libro in Pezzoli, and the Magnificat is exactly in the same position, but none of them have the same format, which tells us that Botticelli was not working with cartoon, at least not for that series. And I think he used cartoons on a very few occasions, but was working with a pool of motif that he will repeat and copy by eye, because there is absolutely no trace of spolvero. And there are different sizes, no squaring either. So very gifted people that were able to actually copy by eye and reduce or enlarge these models, and therefore recycle the motif in order to reconceptualize within this very strict religious iconography, because you have about 4 themes, 4 different type of iconography for this kind of religious work, and all inherited more or less from the Byzantine tradition, apart from one, which is the adoration of the child by the Virgin, which is something that is developed specifically by Filippo Lippi, and Botticelli takes over. Here, I think it's quite interesting to see that because you had to produce so many similar things, you had to find a system in order to fuel in a way this kind of renew this kind of iconography while remaining within the standard of what the clients would expect. And with this range of works, you have really this idea in action. And you don't see it, because if you don't put them side by side, it's very difficult to see this is exactly the same figure reused over and over and over. And for that, I think it's quite it's the tour de force, I would say, by Botticelli, to reuse, to recycle the same things. And there are more type of recycling, which I've staged in a way in the exhibition, where for this motif, which I call the wandering motif, because not only the holy figures like the Madonna and the Child were swapped, reused, but also you have different single motifs that are reused. For instance, the one, the boat, which appears in one of the fresco of the Sistine Chapel, reappears exactly in the same fashion in the Judgment of Paris from the Chini collection, and other works like this. So it's absolutely extraordinary that he managed to have this kind of recycling and each time creating something new. And perhaps the most significant example is the Birth of Venus and the Little Sisters. So the Birth of Venus is a mythological work that we know all very well, and Botticelli doesn't hesitate 1 second. He would withdraw the central figures of Venus and put it against a black background. And here you have, here he probably used a cartoon actually, because if you overlap the 3 figures, they would more or less match. So using the carta lucida and not the spolvero, tracing the contour of the figure, and then reworking by hand the whole drawing, which makes 2 replicas, the one in Berlin and the one in Turin, similar but not identical.
Mm-hmm.
And by then creating yet a new genre, because you can say that Botticelli has invented the nude. Before that, I don't think there is many examples apart from, the Eve within bigger frescoes.
Yes, Hans Kerner has argued that if the birth of Venus disappeared, as it were, into a Medici villa, it's those nudes that really carried his design ideas. And in a way, you can see that with the Lorenzo di Credi.
Yes.
Wait, I don't mean Lorenzo di Credi, do I?
Yeah, no, you do. The third Venus, the Venus of the other Venus of the Uffizi, the one presented. Yes,
the figure
absolutely.
Against, especially putting it against a dark ground. I mean, it's absolutely someone who's been looking at Botticelli and realizing that this carries the idea of Venus, and these works seem to have been selling like mad, according to what we have read about their survival.
Yeah. Absolutely. And if you manage to come to Paris or later to go to the Uffizi, when you look at Lorenzo di Credi up close, you will see the traces of Spolvero, which is absolutely amazing. Every single detail is made through a cartoon which has been pounced. So probably Lorenzo was a good painter, but not a very inventive one, worked out very well his figure before actually making a painting out of it, by creating a cartoon that he would then reproduce. Whereas with, so following a bit of the same process as Botticelli, but not from his own imagination, from the imagination of one of another.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're such fantastic works, and I mean, I'm always surprised at how big they are. They are the size of that Venus, and they, to hang in a domestic setting, they're good size.
Yes, and they were probably, something that I've realized in the exhibition is that they were probably quite high up, because if you crouch, the perspective work much better. If you look at them in a frontal way, the head is slightly small, but if you look at them sotto in su, everything goes back into perspective. So it's interesting from imagining where they were hung in the home in these patrician houses.
We would have to go back, Francois, but we also, I put the two of the coronations that you talked about next to each other with the drawing. Oh, there's the lippy. There's the lippy that influenced the Verrocchio.
Yes.
This drawing, very, very sensitive drawing of the coronation that he then uses several times. And if one of them in the San Marco altarpiece, the other in the Montevarques, I think the two that are here. I just wondered if you had a sense, if we could go to the altarpieces, Francois, how the one on the far right might have been put together. I mean, we can see the connections between the top bits. They obviously relate to the drawing, although they don't reproduce it exactly.
No.
The bottom, so it's not the San Marco, I'm sorry, it's the one from Florida.
Yes, this one is the one in the exhibition.
Yes. How the group of saints and the one on the right, do you think those were pulled together from drawings that existed in a kind of Perugino-like manner?
Yeah, it probably is a mixed match. Of course, the upper register of the San Marco and the one that was for the Abbey of Volterra, which is now in Miami, are much closer to the drawings that we know from Göttingen than the Montevarchi altarpiece, which is now in Villa La Cuyete. So it's probably a further derivation. But what is very interesting in that altarpiece from the Villa La Cuyete, which was for Montevarchi at the time, is the quality of some of the figures in the lower register. I mean, the figure of Lorenzo, for instance, some of them really stand out, whereas you can see there is a huge contribution of the workshop here, as a, you know, one of the many iteration of that composition into registers. So it's quite interesting to see this kind of differences that we can't really understand. The other two quite close to the preparatory drawing, which might be actually preparatory drawings or drawings a ricordo, made after, just to make sure that we fix the images for the sake of the future production, and at the same time the quality of the figures in a work that derives from these first two, but as major contribution from the workshop, with anyway some of the figures that really stands out, especially in the lower part. So this is where I think Botticelli was always keen to, even when he delegated, always keen to go by and just check and then just, intervene directly. And this is why at the end, even if you see some weaknesses, everything stands. And when you see something like the last work in the exhibition, which is the well-known work from the Jacques Marandré, The Flight to Egypt, you see there is something Botticelli in it, but everything goes everywhere. There's absolutely no control, no articulation. And it was probably made after drawings by Botticelli, but probably at a time where Botticelli was not able to supervise anymore, or was already dead, because we know probably the content of his workshop was distributed among his last assistants. Then they may have produced after his death, some Botticellian images that are lacking the control and the quality of the master. So it's a very important, I think, this reflection to understand that when we talk about workshop copies within the time of Botticelli and replicas, it's always under the control of the capobottega. And it's not enough to have drawings by the master to be able to produce a Botticelli. And I think that is something we need to ponder on a bit more often, maybe, especially when we work in an auction.
Yeah, I agree. I also wonder if that particular altarpiece, the Montevarchi, looks as it does or was put together as it was, because it's always connected with those altarpieces that were made to be like the one at Narni by Ghirlandaio. And we don't have a contract for this one, but we do have contracts for others, and they say make it like Narni. And
yes.
At Narni, there was a coronation and some saints underneath. Not quite this many saints, but the saints for each altarpiece change. They're made to relate particularly to the convent that they are being made for. So, I mean, it's an interesting idea that these convents wanted to set up a kind of visual connection among themselves, but also that they wanted to remain unique in a particular way. But for the painters, it might not have been such an interesting commission.
Yes, although it was, again, a tour de force to repeat yourself without repeating yourself, which is what I'm interested in when I'm looking at this. How can you make something new, exciting again, when you've already done a masterpiece like the San Marco, which is the prototype for these works. And interestingly, the one in the middle, which come from Miami, but was for Volterra, was long attributed to a collaboration between Ghirlandaio and Botticelli, but just because actually this, as you said, especially the figures in the lower register in the Volterra one are actually related to Ghirlandaio's model. It is something that he really set up. So that is, but that is also something that is not so surprising, because there were some ensemble that were meant to be harmonious between each other. I mean, the Sistine Chapel is the utmost example of that kind of collaborative efforts with that many artists working to do, an ensemble that will stand as one, with not too many differences or discrepancies. And when you look at the ensemble, they actually work like one system. So it could apply to easel paintings as well.
Yes. You've talked about that picture from Florida as being in not terrific condition. Can you just say which parts of it are repainted?
Well, it's been actually restored for the exhibition, and I'm very grateful to our colleague in Bath Museum for doing that. But the problem is, it was so damaged over the years, over the centuries, that most of the Virgin and the angels in the background are actually completely repainted. The figures that are slightly okay are the one in the lower register, but it seems that something happened to the upper register that has really ruined it. And actually, you have this kind of feel of 18th, 19th century something has happened.
Yes.
But I think it was very interesting to show something that on this part of the world we don't have so many occasions to see. I mean, it's been in Miami for the past 50 years or something, and we managed to reassemble the predella, the small works for the predella for this. And again, within the economy of the workshop, how you would distribute the task to each other. This work was probably made by Botticelli, an assistant. This is very difficult to read now because it has been so damaged. But Botticelli would not hesitate 1 second to delegate the entire Peredella to one of his, trusted long life collaborator, the master of the Gothic buildings that now is identified as one Jacopo Foschi. So I think this is very interesting to try and understand the dynamic of the workshop of Botticelli.
Let's turn now to the mythological pictures, especially the two that are very well known. This picture you would like to redate, the Primavera. Talk us through your argument for that.
Well, it's not that I want to redate it. I just found that it's not so tapestry-like. Many interpretations try to describe it. It is actually very well articulated, mostly on the mostly everything is aligned on the foreground, apart from the figure of Venus slightly in the background, but in the middle background actually. And this is something that by studying the 3 frescoes made by Botticelli in the Sistine Chapel, where you can really see a struggled, development and perfection along the way, that you could actually, that there are many indices that make you think, well, this might not be so much before he left, it may be, or very close to that to that realization. You find some echoes from the frescoes in the 3 Graces, for instance, which are really the sisters of the daughter of Jethro's.
Can we go to that, François? That it's the Sistine. Yeah, I think it is back. Yeah.
Yeah. From the daughter of Jethro's, if you imagine them completely naked without this, they have the kind of the same pose and the same relationship between the two. Of course, there is one missing. Zephyr blowing the wind. You find him again in the last frescoes. So the punishment of Cora, Datam, and Abiron in the Sistine Chapel. You have the same figures. So you have these figures, that reappears, that are so close to the one he used in the Sistine Chapel that you think maybe this is quite interesting. And Botticelli struggled a lot to compose these scenes, and he finally, I think, is at his best in the last fresco, which is the punishment of Cora, Datam, and Abiron, where everything is extremely harmonious and posed and distributed within the picture space, exactly like the Primavera is, and not at all like a tapestry-like production, even though it recalls, of course, an aesthetic of tapestry with this beautiful mille fiori pavement. And it is not, and the way it is constructed, it is not so far away from the birth of Venus. So it's just a reflection that I was trying to propose. It's one reading. It is mine, of course, and it's just a proposal. Absolutely nothing definitive. I wouldn't dare to do so.
Have you seen the underdrawing of the Primavera?
Yes.
Sorry, this is just occurring to me. What does it look like? Are there a lot of changes is really what I'm asking you.
Very few. Very few. It's quite, set up already in his mind. It's quite interesting. But yes, there is very few changes. Some, but it's a very interesting way. There is the Opificio delle Pietre Dure has published a big book about, it was done in the 80s, but it gives you a lot of information about the making and the technique used in the Primavera.
But not the underdrawing.
No.
It's not, they didn't publish it there.
No, you have to go other ways.
Yes. Well, it's interesting that there are not that many changes. So, I mean, there are numerous figures here, and he must have carefully worked out how to put them together. Because as you know, there are changes in the birth of Venus, But in some ways, they're changes that have to do with meaning. I mean, we know that he puffed out the faces of the winds as he was in the act of drawing, and realized after he had transferred his initial ideas that the wind would push everything one way, so that you couldn't have Venus's hair flying out on both sides, for instance, and he alters that and also pushes in the collar of the cloak. And I find that very interesting, because you can see him making realizations about the meaning of the picture as he's working through it on the support. I think he was thinking all the time, and found it actually very hard to stop thinking about formal relationships, but also how to make the meaning clear.
Yes, and absolutely. And I think you see that very well in the series of Dante's drawings, where meaning is so, is at the forefront, where it's a constant research for the distribution of the figures in the space of the parchment, an animation of the figures, a relationship between, because in the end, it was quite a tour de force to represent one single canto per drawing. It has never been done before. And you had to really work out very hard to make it clear. If you read Dante, it's already so full of imagery, so full of events within one canto, that it appears very difficult to actually manage to represent it all. And Botticelli does it, and he does it so well that at some point some of the drawings are even a commentary on the text, because you have in some of them you have bits and pieces of the following canto coming up, because it's already announced within the text. And I when I discovered that, I found that was absolutely genius, and a proof that he was constantly thinking about what he was doing and at the meaning of it.
I think we're about to see, whoops. Okay.
I think we'll have to move softly to the to the late work, as we're running a little bit short.
Oh, we're running very late. Okay. Let's move to the late works. We'll just skip over the designs. Really, they were there to underline that you are making that strong point about Botticelli, that he's not just a painter, he's making designs for all kinds of works. But the late works have always been problematic in terms of how we understand Botticelli, the man. And I thought we could end with what you think. Was he a follower of Savonarola? What kind of distinction can we make between market demand and personal belief in regard to these pictures?
Well, in my opinion, he was not a piagnone, as you would call them at the time. He was not a follower of Savonarola, because he would have questioned so much his art and all his career that he would have stopped painting, I think. And in the accounts of the time, you never see his name within the partisan of Savonarola. He never signed the two petitions to rehabilitate Savonarola. He doesn't appear in his brother's Simone's Cronaca, who was a devoted piagnone. And even Dolfo Spini, who was the chief, the head of the Arrabbiati, so the adversaries of the Piagnoni, would go to his workshop and discuss things. But I think Botticelli was, as a sensible and sensitive painter, extremely receptive to what was happening, and you couldn't stay completely unaffected by the very violent preaching of the monk, and the metaphors that he would use, the very apocalyptic metaphors that he would use, and the fact that the taste in Florence has fundamentally changed. So as a good capo bottega who needs to run his workshop, he has to adapt to something that to a taste that has fundamentally changed. Hence, in my opinion, there's two ways. Here we only see one of these, but in the exhibition there is a beautiful example of another temptation of Botticelli to respond to that change of taste, going back to some archaism, as we can see in the Mystic Nativity, in the Communion of San Jerome, and of course in the Capolavoro of the Pitti, where you have the figures that are disproportioned, too big or too small, with some kind of roughness. So he's trying to abandon this idea of grace that infused all his work so far. But if you look at another Piagnone commission, which is very Piagnone because it comes from Prato, and Prato, we know, remained devoted to the monk for many years, even after his death. He did this beautiful crucifix that illustrates a well-known theme for the monk, which is the acceptation of the sacrifice of Christ on the cross. And instead of having something tormented and violent, you have a depiction of a Christ that looks almost sanctified, blessed within this death that was predicted from the beginning. And this is a vision that is really, I think, filtered by Botticelli's art. So he's sublimizing a violent preaching, a violent image into something, into an image of peace and beauty. And when you look at this, I don't know what you felt, Michel, in front of this crucifix, but when I discovered it in Palazzo Pretorio, actually in Prato, I was completely astonished by the beauty and the calm and what he would convey to you. This sense of peace that he would convey to you. So I think there was two ways. He tried really two ways to answer this new taste, and none of them succeeded. And we know that because in the 5 last years of his life, it was so bad that he was so indebted at the end of his life that his own family refused his inheritance. And there was no inventory of the workshop, so we don't know what's left in it. We don't know what it was, but probably it may have been similar to the inventory of Filippino Lippi, who died a few years before him. So I think it's very interesting, but I think the fact that he produced so much after and during and after Savonarola plea for the fact that he wasn't a Savonarolian, or at least he wasn't a Piagnone, which doesn't mean he didn't try to adapt to what the monk was requesting.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think you can tell. There's the market and then there's the person, and the person needed to respond to the market. Other kinds of documents can, as you outlined, can give us a sense of whether or not he followed the Savonarola. But the pictures are working with a very dramatic change in taste, as you say.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to you both.